guess we got, well, there's still people coming in. We'll go ahead and get started rather than waiting the extra 5 minutes. I want to thank you guys for coming out. Today we have an event on law enforcement without government with Professor Friedman and our own Professor Simmons. I have a few things to just mention before we get going. The first is dues. As I've been shouting and screaming about for the past month and a half now, dues are due by the end of this month. There will be several other events this month, so you can pay them then. And again, you don't have to pay to be a member to come to these events. You do have to pay if you want to run for office and to vote in elections. So those are, dues are $5, and they can be paid to Thad, the gentleman in black right here. There's another event also on Thursday I want to mention. It's in Saxby. You can see the signs, Robots in the Skies. It's a debate on drone strikes. And of course we got to use the Transformer, motif and stuff, so that's cool. Now I will give a brief introduction for each of our speakers. Since this one is a speech with commentary, it's not a debate, the format will be Professor Friedman will have about 30 to 45 minutes to talk, and Professor Simmons will have a 10-minute commentary, and then afterwards we'll take questions from the audience. Professor David Friedman is one of the nation's foremost libertarian theorists. He earned an MS and a PhD from the University of Chicago, and is a widely published scholar with more than 2 decades of experience in academia, having taught extensively at the undergraduate and graduate levels. His area of expertise ranges from business and economics to law. He's published economic analyses of affirmative action, punitive damages, trade secret law, and accident law. Professor Friedman has also written on topics of price theory, medical care, population economics, the economics of war, historical perspectives on freedom, and criminal defense. And Rick Simmons, who many of you know, the Zen Master of Evidence Law, is a graduate of Columbia Law School, where he was a Stone Scholar and senior editor of the Columbia Law Review. He has also served for 4 years as an assistant district attorney for New York County and was an acting assistant professor at NYU Law School from June 2000 until June 2003. Here he teaches evidence, criminal law, and prosecution practicum, and is the author of what can only be described as the best damn law school book ever written, Learning Evidence from the Federal Rules of the Courtroom. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Friedman.
So I'm going to be talking today about law without government. And I thought it would be useful to divide it into 3 topics, property, contract, and law in general. And I'm going to start with property because a statement that one repeatedly sees is that property is a creation of the state, a creation of the government. And it is sometimes argued, therefore, that one has no basis for objecting to government seizing property or controlling property because you wouldn't have any property if it weren't for the government anyway. This is a claim which is demonstrably false. It's demonstrably false because property not only predates the existence of government, it predates the existence of the human race. Property is observed in the behavior of many other species, in particular many birds and fishes, in the form of what is called territorial behavior. And I'm going to argue that territorial behavior is in a primitive form the same strategic structure, as it were, the same game theoretic basis on which private property in humans and much else is based. How does territorial behavior work? An animal in some way marks a territory that it is claiming. Some birds do it apparently by singing particular things around the border, various other animals in other ways. Once it has marked its territory, a trespasser of its own species and gender will be attacked. If it observes another member of the same species coming onto its territory, the claimant will attack that member. And it will fight more and more desperately the deeper into the territory the trespasser comes. And the critical fact to realize here is that a fight to the death is usually a loss for both sides. That conflict is not a zero-sum game. Consequently, unless the trespasser is much more formidable than the defender, it is in the rational interest of the trespasser to back down once it knows that the defender is somehow or other committed to fight to the death if it has to. And that's a form of property, as I say, which is observed in many species other than ours, and clearly it's not dependent on government enforcement. One of the things that got me thinking about territorial behavior was the more general question, I suppose philosophical question, of in what sense a society is ever out of a Hobbesian state of nature. All right, as probably many of you know, Thomas Hobbes famously described the state of nature where everybody was at war with everybody else as one where life was various unpleasant things, of which the last was short. But then in what sense is that not our world? That you say, well, we're not in a state of nature because if somebody attacks you, the police will arrest him. But what makes the police do that? What keeps the police from just stealing from you? They sometimes do that, but rarely. What creates the order? It isn't sufficient to say we have an orderly society because there are laws, because laws don't enforce themselves. Because there are policemen, but why do the policemen act as they do? What creates, as it were, the orderly pattern in ordinary civil society? And my answer is a fancier version of the same thing that creates territorial behavior in animals. And I like to imagine the following transaction. You'll suppose that you live in a suburban neighborhood where the local law enforcement is not very competent or aggressive or hardworking. And one day, your next-door neighbor gets in a conversation with you across the fence. And he says, you know, I've been thinking that taking my trash to the dump is really a pain. And I've decided instead I'm just going to dump my trash across the fence onto your property. And you know and I know that given the nature of law enforcement in this county, it's going to be a real pain for you to do anything about it. But I got a deal for you. Instead of you're going through all the trouble of trying to stop me from doing this, just pay me $15 a month and I'll agree not to do it. And the question is, why do you turn down that demand? Why does he in fact know he'll turn down the demand and not make it? And the basic answer is that you've got a sort of an invisible line defining what's yours and what's his. And you have committed yourself to bear not infinite costs, but unreasonably large costs in defending that line. And why is it desirable to have somehow tweaked your brain to that commitment so you'll react that way? Because the result is that you don't have to defend it because people know you're committed to defend it, just like the birds and the fishes, and therefore most of the time people respect your property line. The other point that essentially raised the same issue to me on the international rather than the individual scale was the Falkland Islands War. Here you've got the United Kingdom bearing very large costs, sending military units around the world up near Antarctica in order to defend a couple of islands with, 200 people living on them, of very little value to anybody. And, there are various theories about they thought there might be oil or something that was valuable enough, but I think it's pretty clear the real reason was that it was theirs. It was British territory, they regarded it as British territory, and here someone was taking it away from them. And that England and most countries are committed to a strategy of we will bear, not infinite costs, but unreasonably large costs defending what's ours. And if we weren't committed to that strategy, next it would be Gibraltar. And maybe after that, some other area we claim. And who knows at what point the French would decide that their old alliance with Scotland ought to be revived. You can think of all sorts of possibilities. So what I want to claim is that if you look at how functioning societies work, they work on a set of commitment strategies where if the police mistreat you in certain ways, you'll go to a lot more trouble than the circumstances seem to warrant to report them, if your neighbors mistreat you, and so forth. I have an article on this I put up my webpage because I have lots more to talk about than 45 minutes will cover, and unfortunately most of it's in writing, and the article is called A Positive Account of Property Rights. It's really rights in general, but it was written for a property rights conference. It's a published article, but you can also read it on my webpage. And I go into a good deal more detail about the logic of this sort of strategic situation. But I was reminded of all of it quite recently by an article on the subject of parking places in Chicago. Because what the article reported is that when there's a snowstorm in Chicago, people's cars get snowed in, and the owner of the car then goes to a good deal of effort to dig out his car. And having dug out his car, he's just produced a valuable item, namely a parking place free of snow. And having produced this, he naturally enough wants to keep ownership of it. And so the custom in Chicago is, and also I observed the same custom in Boston quite recently, that when you've cleared a parking space, you put an old chair or something similar in the space to symbolically mark your property claim, and you drive off. And you expect that when you come back an hour and a half later, the